Hey folks, welcome to this webinar today brought to you by the Tamarack Institute. We're going to focus on the essential mindsets and skill sets of backbone leaders. And welcome everybody. As I said, I'm Liz Weaver. My colleague Chris Thompson is on the call. We'll be leading the majority of the webinar. Chris and I are both very interested in collective impact and this really unique role of backbone leaders. We come at it maybe slightly from different perspectives, but we'll see as we have our conversation today. I'm now going to throw it over to my colleague Connor, who's going to take us through a land acknowledgement. So Connor, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us in the world. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So we begin this webinar by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of the Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I am personally joining from Takaranto, colonially known as Toronto, Ontario. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. By acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I am trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, and political context embedded within the lands known as Canada, and commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land.
Great, thank you so much, Connor. Hey everybody, it's my real pleasure to introduce you to the webinar today, the essential mindsets and skill sets of backbone leaders. And I'm also going to introduce you to my colleague, Chris Thompson. Chris and I have known each other, I think, for quite a while now, Chris, at least 7 or more years. But I'll tell you a little bit about Chris and his work. Chris is the founder and president of Civic Collaboration Consultants, LLC. He supports a variety of collective impact efforts addressing public health and safety, housing and food security, education, and economic development. Most relevant to today's discussion, Chris devotes a significant amount of his time coaching leaders of backbones and providing professional development services to backbone staff. Chris speaks regularly on collaborative leadership and on collective impact at conferences, and his writing has been published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review and in other publications. Before forming Civic Collaboration Consultants, he was the director of regional engagement for the Fund for Our Economic Future, a founders collaborative that has deployed more than $2 million to address economic priorities in Northeast Ohio. He's the author of, now I'm going to say this wrong, Chris, Collaborations or Collaboration?
No, that's actually just collaboration.
Collaborations, a guide to cross-sector collaboration, which was published with the fund. And so, Chris, why don't you share with us something that we would like to know that isn't necessarily in your bio?
Well, my therapy for cross-sector collaboration is fly fishing. I found that this work is pretty demanding, and it's great to just go stand in a river and let the water wash it all away and cleanse the mind. So if I'm not facilitating a collaborative, I'm probably standing in a river.
Yeah, and you've come to Canada many times to stand in our kind of Northern Ontario and further north rivers, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I want to go back.
Yeah, pretty soon we're opening our borders. For those that don't know a lot about collective impact, we thought we would start with a little bit of a grounding in the collective impact framework. So Chris, do you want to take us through this framework?
Sure. And I think it's really important that you use the word framework rather than model, because that is often a word that's attached with collective impact. And I always prefer framework because it's not a recipe, right? It's not a model that we can follow step by step in a linear process. But there's these 5 conditions that need to be present for collective impact to be achieved. And a common agenda for change is often considered the first one, sometimes referred to as well as a shared purpose. We need shared measurement for data and results to better understand what is the status quo and how are we progressing towards our desired change. Mutually reinforcing activities reflects that we have diverse players at the table of our collective effort. And while what the city might be working on versus a social service agency versus a business may be different activities, hopefully they're aligned and can be coordinated in mutually reinforcing ways. Communicating across a diverse set of players is critically important and also very challenging. But to do collective work, we need to have constant communication. And orchestrating that communication and a lot of the other conditions of collective impact is this collaboration capacity that our friends at FSG labeled the backbone. So that's become a kind of standard term for the more generic label that I put on it is collaboration capacity. Years ago, I was quoted in a book saying, if you're going to do this collective work, someone has to buy the donuts. The backbone buys the donuts. It obviously does more than provides the food at a meeting. It coordinates the meetings, facilitates the meetings, oftentimes synthesizes the data so that it can be used collectively. And thrilled to have so many folks who are working for a backbone on this call and look forward to learning with you today.
Yeah, thanks for taking us through that. As you know, Chris, we at Tamarack wrote an article called Collective Impact 3.0 that we'll include as a post email. And, when we were talking about backbone, we started to refer to it not as just solely some people, but the container, right? Because it is the buying of the donuts, but it's also the facilitating of the process, all the things, good governance structures, all those things that fit within that container. And that's really what we're going to talk about today is, what are the mindsets and skill sets that folks that are in that container or supporting that container really need to have at the core of their work.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, so we're going to start off with a question to you. So why do backbone leaders need to think about mindsets and skill sets? And what's the difference maybe between them?
Yeah, sure. So I think it helps to repeat really the purpose of a backbone, as you described it, the container. It is to facilitate and coordinate the collective efforts of diverse partners. So the backbone works across a host of organizations. And if you just step back for a moment, that's a really unusual role in our communities. Most of us just work for one organization. The backbone staff really work with a whole host of organizations. I'd say that's unusual and even weird. It's difficult. It's not like working for a traditional organization at all. And all of us are much more familiar with traditional organizations than we are working with a backbone. And that means we have to think about things differently, which is the mindset. And we have to use skills that might be very valuable in the traditional organization, but they're super valuable in a backbone.
So it's interesting, right? So there is a kind of an orientation to this work, a thought, a mind process, and then there's the actual skills that we need to be bringing forward. So yeah, I think it's helpful to think about the work and the role in these two dimensions, right? So how are backbones really different? So you've alluded to this a little bit, but how would a backbone be different from, let's say, a traditional organization?
There's a lot of differences, but for today's conversation, I'm going to focus on three because I think they're relevant to the mindset and skills that backbone leaders need to have. Anyone can create an organization, but backbones can only be created by the community. If I said today, I want to create a backbone to work on homelessness, end homelessness in my community, I can't say that because I don't have all the other players in the homeless that work on homelessness would look at me and say, who are you, Chris Thompson, to assert you're going to be the backbone? So if you're working for a backbone, you're really not working for an organization. You're working for the community that created the backbone. So that's the first difference. The second is most organizations are created to provide a direct service. Backbones are created to disrupt the inequitable status quo in our community. That's why we have a backbone. There's an inequitable status quo. We've got lots of organizations working on that priority, and we need someone to coordinate, align, facilitate that work. That's an unusual type of service. The third big difference is leaders of traditional organizations focus as much as possible on what they can control. Inherently, when you're working for a backbone, you're working on things that you cannot control. That is a huge difference that, along with the other differences that I mentioned, really make it the backbone an incredibly important job and a really difficult one and a really unusual one.
Yeah. You know what I hear you say, which I think is really helpful and interesting, is this notion of community, being centered in community. And I often talk about it as both facing inward and facing outward, right? Yeah. So those of us that are engaged in backbone work have to sometimes face inward to drive the work forward, but more often face outward to leverage those mutually reinforcing activities, to see how to see where those system shifts can happen, those kinds of things, to be really agile and adaptive in our communities.
Liz, one of my mentors in this work said, when you're working for a backbone, one of the common questions you have to ask yourself is, who says I'm the backbone? And what am I the backbone of exactly? Right? And that's that outward facing that you just talked about. Who says you're the backbone? If it's only you, you're probably not much of a backbone.
Yeah, great question, and a great opportunity to reflect on kind of that inward outward piece. The other thing I heard you say when you were talking about those 3 points is this notion of disruption, right? So disrupting the status quo that is often an inequitable status quo in our community.
Yeah, that's why we do this work, right? If we thought the status quo, what we're producing now, what our outcomes are, whether in education or the social determinants of health or whatever they might be, we're okay. We just keep doing what we're doing, but they're not okay. And so we need to be disruptive. And, that alluded to it, we'll talk about it more, that commitment to disruption is part of the mindset that needs to be at the front and center for backbone staff.
Let's move on to the next question. And so this goes into the mindset piece, which is really, how does the unusual nature of a backbone influence the mindset of backbone leaders? So we already heard that it's it's container-like, it has some different elements to it. So how does that really influence a mindset, do you think?
Yeah, and I'll go back to what we were just talking about. The emphasis needs to be on being disruptive, but it's also being empathetic, because you are not being disruptive. You're helping your partners disrupt the status quo. You are, as a backbone, you're probably not in a position to disrupt the status quo unilaterally. You're helping the partners in the collaborative disrupt the status quo. So say, two really good words that kind of describe the mindset of staff and leadership of a backbone, including the board, is empathetic disruptor. Those are two good words for the mindset. Two not so good words for the mindset are in control.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more about that.
Well, your backbones are, as I referenced earlier, there's not much the backbones are in control of. And you have to be okay with that. That's a mindset that you have to be able to bring to the table. You're working on behalf of others that you have no real power or authority over. You have to, obviously you can influence them, so you have to understand them and appreciate what's important to them, and that's where the empathy comes in. And then you have to translate that understanding into helping them figure out what they need to do differently to disrupt the status quo.
And we're going to explore that a little bit more in this question, which is around power and control, right? This set of questions. And so what are the power and control challenges that face backbones, particularly, in the preconditions of collective impact? They talk about influential champions as a precondition. So our mind might initially go to, how we would individually define influential champions. And so there could be power dynamics even in how we explore that. So why don't you talk a little bit about these two questions, Chris?
Sure. So let's talk about power for a moment, because increasingly I view the work of the backbone as creating a healthy power dynamic in our community. One of the reasons we have an inequitable status quo is we have an unhealthy power dynamic. And so you have to think about, what does it mean to have a healthier power dynamic? One way to build a healthier power dynamic is to share power. So invariably, most of collective impact efforts are organized by people with some institutional power and authority, including funders, public, private, philanthropic, right? But to avoid it being just the powerful people trying to tell everyone else what to do, we've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years exploring how do we do a better job of embedding equity and true community leadership into our collective impact efforts, right? How do we ground them in community? Well, we do that by sharing power, and the backbone does that by acknowledging they have no power and that they need to act in ways of influence rather than through authority. And they have to create this healthier power dynamic in our community. I think one of the more common challenges for backbones to deal with, particularly the top executive of a backbone, is how little power they have. Right? They may be the CEO or the executive director of the backbone, but that's not much. They're certainly not the CEO of the movement that we're working on, the collective impact effort. They're not the CEO of that. They don't get to order anybody around. And that requires, a special mindset, because most CEOs are trained how to use, command and control to achieve the goals of the organization. That's normal behavior and perfectly acceptable in a traditional organization and completely ineffective in a backbone.
It's really interesting, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is the notion of hierarchy versus horizontal community building, right? And really thinking about how we create community. And it seems to me what we're exploring is that folks around a backbone team or around a leadership table have to be comfortable with the community, the horizontalness of this work, but also in some cases actually bring in their hierarchical to help advance the work. So it's that kind of tension of vertical alignment and horizontal alignment. I don't know if that's too weird a concept, but it's something I've been.
No, I hope it's not. I was just reading an interesting piece yesterday that I think is 3 or 4 years old. So I'm, like a lot of people, still catching up on my reading. I'll be reading forever. But it was an article that made the point that it's not hierarchy or structures, whether hierarchical or horizontal, aren't the issue. It's the power that's the issue. How is power exercised within the structure? And one of the roles of the backbone is to help the partners have a more honest discussion about the power dynamic and to address what it takes to create a healthier power dynamic in our community so that everyone belongs, everyone's voice is heard, and that we can move forward together. We don't talk about power nearly enough because it's an uncomfortable subject, particularly for those who have power. It's amazing how the more powerful people in the room never want to talk about the power dynamic.
And yet it is something that we all encounter,
Yes.
particularly when we're trying to move efforts of community change forward, right? It's really interesting to me that has been a big focus as well. In the 10th anniversary of Collective Impact is this, they've always talked about equity, but it has been a really important focus, is how do we embed in our work, in our skill sets, in our mindsets, this equity lens as the foundational core to collective impact work. And I think that is so critical. Hey, so let's dive a little bit deeper into mindsets. So what are some of the other mindsets? So we've talked about power. What are some of the other mindsets that can help someone thrive?
Yeah, you need to be adaptive because things change, right? I quote a colleague in this work who said, we need to be comfortable with uncertainty and strive for clarity. If we can have that as a mindset, I think we're in a good place, right? Because things are never certain. There's a lot of uncertainty in this work, but if we can be clear about our purpose and our role and our commitment to equity and those kinds of things, it gets better. We need to be motivated by our outcomes, not by glory or power, right? If the mindset is, I want to run the show, there's plenty of places for you in your community. Running a backbone is probably not it. We talk a lot about the notion of servant leadership, collaborative leadership, systems leadership. To me, those are all terms that, if you dig in on them, you get to learn more about the kind of mindset that's required for that kind of leadership.
And so one other thing that I think about when I think about this is sometimes having courage is a great one, right? To have the courage to ask more uncomfortable questions or to surface those more uncomfortable questions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, very, very much so. And when we talk about skills, one of the skills is the skill of inquiry and, pushing people to think differently, not by telling them how to think, but by asking questions that prompt them to say, well, I wonder if, what would it look like if, what would it take to? Those are all questions that backbones help the partners ask. And that's risky business.
Yeah.
Asking questions poorly has a lot of blowback potential. And even when we ask questions well, people, can react negatively to having their sacred cows questioned. But if you want to disrupt the status quo, we're going to have to ask some uncomfortable questions.
So that leads us into this next part that is more focused on skills. So what skills? So inquiry is one of those skills, but what other what other skills do you think are valuable, particularly valuable?
Yeah, so there are a lot of skills, and I've been lifting material and ideas from people like you and others who've been working in this space. And I've find myself working a lot with backbone leaders and leaders of collective efforts on 5 skills. And particularly, I've been doing some work with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas across Texas and into New Mexico with a host of different collaborative leaders. And we've really been diving deeply into the 5 skills. And the first one's facilitation, which is really about helping the partners make decisions and move forward together with strong relationships and a healthy power dynamic. And I think facilitation was a skill that I know in my history, I was never trained in it, and I probably undervalued it. And now I overweight its value in terms of who do you want working and leading a collective effort. They really have to be skilled at facilitation, and highly recommend Adam Kahane's new book on facilitating breakthrough to help you think about that skill differently. The second skill we work on a lot is evaluation. We have to be able to assess how well the partners are interacting together. And one of the most common observations I make about collective impact efforts is how we work together is just as important as what we work on together. It may take us months or years to evaluate the what, but we can evaluate the how right away from day one, from before day one, and kind of help folks assess how well are we working together and how do we apply what we've learned from that assessment so that we can work better together. And really that's at the heart of the Backbone's job, is to help everyone in the community work better together to address the priority. The third skill we work on is understanding context. Really, the Backbone staff need to have not only like a 30,000 foot view, but a 360-degree view of what's going on, as well as a very granular understanding of what is happening, particularly the priorities, motivations, and constraints of each partner. There's lots of moving parts when we're working on systemic, complex challenges. The Backbone staff really have to dig in on that and work hard to understand the context, including those shifting factors that might be way outside anyone's control. Inquiry is one we referenced. I just want to quickly mention, Liz, that I define it as asking new compelling questions and listening deeply to the answers that emerge. It's not just asking the good new question, it's listening to the responses and listening in a way that makes it so that the answers can influence our strategies. And who do we listen to, right? Is it only the powerful that get heard, or is it everyone? Are we asking old rotten questions that reinforce the status quo, or new questions that get us thinking differently about what might be possible? I refer to inquiry, by the way, as the superpower, because if you get that right, a lot can flow from the questions, the inquiry that you practice. The most important skill, I think, is building trust, because Backbone staff don't control partners. They have to build trust with them so they can influence them. Backbone staff also need to build trust among the partners. Building trust is a skill. We can get better at behaving in ways that build trust. Those are my big 5: building trust, inquiry, understanding context, evaluation, and facilitation.
I wonder if there's one step further with the building trust, which is also building trust with your community, which is some of that inward facing again, right? Because
yes,
community, for a collective impact to be successful, a community has to also believe that it has the ability to shift things.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, one of the lines I use about collective impact is it's rarely possible, and when possible, nearly impossible to achieve. And it's rarely possible because it's hard to build trust with the community. I mean, most of the inequitable status quo that our community is dealing with is not new. It's been around for 100 years in many cases, right? Housing inequity is not a new issue in most of our communities. So building trust with the community that not only are we going to work on this, but we're going to work on it differently than we have in all of our past efforts. That's a high hurdle to clear. I mean, one of the most important questions to answer as you start a collective impact effort is, why is this effort going to be different than all of the other attempts to address this wicked, persistent puzzle in our community? That's a difficult answer to create without trust.
Yeah. Really, really interesting to hear your perspectives around Backbone and the mindsets and skill sets. For those of you that have been listening in, please put your questions into either the Q&A box or the chat box, and we're going to open it up to some questions from the larger group. But I have one question for Chris, as you all are thinking about your questions. And my question is, you have the perch, as we do at Tamarack, of, engaging with a lot of collective impact efforts, or a lot of Backbone practitioners or leaders, or so what other advice would you have? What reflections do you have for these practitioners?
First, I'd like to say thank you for doing this difficult work. Our communities depend on people doing this work, but we've been talking about, it requires a particular mindset and skills, and we need to help staff develop that mindset and strengthen those skills. They should be provided with safe spaces to practice these skills. You shouldn't have to practice them under real world circumstances, right? We can work in safe spaces to get better at building trust. We can practice asking new compelling questions and listening deeply to the answers. And in my work, particularly the work with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, I've found that Backbone staff value practicing these skills and developing this mindset with their peers. So the more we can create cohorts of practitioners so that they can learn and practice together, I think our communities are well served. And in most communities that I work in, there's usually a couple collective efforts going on. There's usually not just one. And even if there is just one, there's probably a community not too far away that's working on something similar. And today, thanks to the technological leaps that we've all taken, and courtesy of a pandemic, we should be able to do a better job of creating cohorts to help the staff and others working in the container of the Backbone to practice these skills and develop these mindsets so that they don't have to do them, just develop them simply by doing. Creating a place to practice makes sense in my book.
Chris, our first question is from Susan.
Okay.
Do you have any recommended resources for skill building and inquiry, asking those questions?
Yes, I do. I'm going to look over to my bookshelf. A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger is a wonderful book. And I'm trying to remember Edgar Schein's book on questions. I know I've got it here. Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein is another wonderful resource, and anything you can read from Edgar is very helpful. And I would even say Adam Kahane's new book, Facilitating Breakthrough, he has a set of questions that facilitators of collective efforts need to ask on a regular basis. So those are three resources that I would cite.
Yeah, and the one I might throw in as an addition to that is a group called Human Systems Dynamics. That's a mouthful, but they have a lot about inquiry and practicing inquiry. And I've really benefited from their thinking in that. So when we do our post email to you, we'll provide some links to those. Chris, if you can remember the 2 books, and I'll
I have a bibliography that I will share.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Hey, our next question is from Louise, and Louise asks how to approach community that is new to you. So how do you approach a community when you're new to that community? Or Louise, maybe we can have a little bit more clarification around that, but let's start with how to approach a community that is new to you. What would you do?
Yeah. So, you know, and I have encountered that with people from outside of a community, or maybe they were in the community but had a fairly narrow role in their old job, and now they are working in the backbone to try to, you know, coordinate and facilitate the activity of multiple players. And they don't know you, and you don't know them, right? And so this is where Edgar Schein's book on humble inquiry can be very helpful. It takes a lot of humility to go to the group with a lot of questions and listen to their answers, right? Not listening for judgment, but listening for understanding. And so one observation that I get back from the coaching clients that I work with is, Chris, you only give us one set of advice every time. It's go have more meetings one-to-one with folks. And that is a common advice that I give. I think if you're new to the community, you cannot possibly spend enough time meeting one-to-one with stakeholders. A colleague in this work that I know Liz knows well, Deb Halliday out of Montana, you know, talks about the 100 cups of coffee that are required to do this work well. And if you don't drink coffee, just be prepared to drink a lot of tea or water. Spend a lot of time getting to understand the priorities, motivations, and constraints of the community that you're working in, the individuals, not just those with power.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm scanning through as we're chatting and as you're answering to the comments that are in the chat box. A really interesting conversation that's going in the chat box. So I'm going to read a question. It's a commenting question from Gareth. We're contemplating using collective impact to accelerate climate action by many sectors within our community. Is anyone on the call aware of collective impact initiatives with a similar goal? And Chris, anything particular comes to mind when tackling climate action? So I have an answer to that, but I'm going to also see how you might answer it, Chris.
I would defer to you, and also recommend that Gareth looks at the work of Co-Creative, a DC-based collaboration consulting enterprise. They got their start, the leaders there, working on green supply chain issues, and so I think the collective impact framework is ideal for climate action because it requires a cross-sector approach. No, it's not a technical problem. There's plenty of technical problems involved in it, but it's an adaptive challenge for all of our communities. I think part of the challenge with any collective effort is what are the boundaries of that effort? And when you're dealing with climate change, developing clear boundaries that make sense for everyone is very hard because it touches everything.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And particularly with climate, it can be so big and so interrelated and so complex as a problem. Gareth, I would point you to the Tamarack website. We have just launched a collective impact initiative that is focused on climate action and bringing community into the conversation. And so that's some work. It's just a brand new area of practice that we have at Tamarack, but one that has garnered a lot of interest already across Canada. They're doing a cohort of folks that they're bringing together from a variety of communities, and they had to close it off because there were so many people that were interested. They thought they would start with 10, they expanded that, and then had to close it off. But lots of that work will be open source and public to you. So feel free to go to the Tamarack website and find out more about that. There's some really great conversations here.
Yeah, Liz, I'd love to lift up a couple questions.
Sure.
One of them was by Susan DeLandon. I apologize, Susan, if I mispronounced your name. You're referencing places to practice these skills are so crucial. And someone else asked, where do we find these places to practice these skills? And I'll throw a couple ideas your way. The funders of collective impact efforts, particularly the funders of a backbone, are normally philanthropy or a governmental unit or something like United Way, which is a mix between, which is business philanthropy, at least in the US. And they're often funders of multiple collective efforts. So I would encourage you to talk with the funders of a backbone to say, hey, we've noticed you're funding a collective effort around homelessness, and you're doing another one around the social determinants of health. And I'm working on one involving public safety. Would you entertain the notion of bringing us together so that we can learn from each other as backbone practitioners, backbone board members, other members of the container, using that term from Tamarack. So that's one source, funders. There's another venue potential for practicing this. Most communities have some sort of leadership development effort. And in my community of Cleveland, it's called the Cleveland Leadership Center. In other communities, it's Leadership Akron or Leadership Columbus, something like that. You might want to talk to them about the importance of these kinds of collaborative leadership skills, because they cut across lots of civic work, not just the specific work of a backbone. Maybe they would be interested in hosting a cohort of people interested in these collaborative leadership skills and giving a space for people to learn about them and practice them. So those are two options for doing it. Obviously, the third option is just creating the cohort yourself, calling up your friends who are doing similar work and say, you want to get together and figure out how to do it. There's lots of the great news is there's tons of resources available to practice this, to help you get better at it. Tamarack Institute's website is full of resources. I rely on it all the time. And there are many other resources that are out there that you can use. It's hard to carve out time for this. I understand that. And that's why my first recommendation is talk to the funders of collective efforts to see if they would put together a training cohort that will allow you the space and the room to practice these skills.
Hey, great. Thanks for that, Chris. Now we have to, we're wrapping up because I know we're coming to the top of the hour. So thank you, everybody, for joining us on the call today. Really happy to engage in this conversation with you, Chris. And, it's always interesting to me to think about this really interesting role of backbone and what it takes and what are the mindsets and skill sets. Hey, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Chris, for sharing your thoughts and your perspectives about backbones and mindsets and skill sets. And I love the distinction, right? Because I do think there is this orientation of how we think about this work. And then there is the piece around, the skills that we need to do the work. So thank you very much for sharing that wisdom today.
My pleasure, Liz, and thank you for all that you've done to influence my work and the work of others who are trying trying to catalyze enduring positive community change.
Great. Bye, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.